Well, thank you so much. I mean, I've had a wonderful time here. Everybody's been very, very welcoming, and I've had extraordinarily interesting conversations both with senior members and with graduate students, and I hope we'll be able to carry that on. One of the things we've managed to do a little bit today and further last week was to actually break down the kind of boat race difference between Oxford and Cambridge, and indeed bring London in as well. So I think the future of graduate studies and postgraduate studies is actually bringing people together across what is, after all, a very small country. And we'll be thinking about that later. This professorship is in historiography. And of course, in one way, historiography is about the broad context of historical argument with no particular author to it in a kind of Foucauldian vein. But on the other hand, I think it's very important to think about what particular historians managed to do for the subject at various periods. So yesterday I was talking about Marshal G S Hodgson and his understanding of the Arab world and the way that that actually formed the beginnings of what we now call global history and global intellectual history. And today I'll be talking about Albert Hourani. And what I wanted to say, because there were some critiques yesterday which suggested that by criticizing these figures, one is in fact demeaning them. I think the opposite is actually true, that we have to ask why it is that people who wrote 50 or 60 years ago, 50 in the case of Hourani, are still read and are still important and are still informing the way we think about things. And this reminds me of one of my own colleagues, Dennis Twitchett, a great historian of China, who said to me just at the point when I was producing my first book, no book lasts longer than 8 years, remember it. Now, well, actually, the people I've been talking about have lasted a lot longer, and the issue is why some of their ideas have continued to be significant in the historical profession, and others have fallen by the wayside. So Albert Hourani's Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age was published just over 50 years ago. I knew Hourani at St Antony's College in the late 1960s, and my admiration for his work has led me to try and contrast, it's a very difficult thing, and compare some aspects of Arabic, in his terms, political thought, particularly Muslim Arabic political thought in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with some of my own findings on Indian liberal thought over the same period. The aim is to make some preliminary comparative observations in the spirit of what has been called global intellectual history, a set of ideas developed by, among others, Faisal Devji here, Shruti Kapila, Andrew Sartori in Colombia, and many others over the last 5 or 7 years. And it's a style of history that has attempted to adopt and adapt some of the methodologies of European intellectual historians. At the same time, it seeks to provide a broader context for the corpus of existing monographic studies of the history of ideas in extra-European societies, a notable example of which, of course, is Arabic thought itself. Yet this project immediately runs into conceptual and linguistic problems. In particular, Shruti Kapila, for instance, notes the danger of assuming the powerful influence of ideas, especially ideas passing from Europe to the rest of the world, when in fact what we are observing is mere recitation or even rejection, as when Gandhi in his first major work, Hind Swaraj, referred to the Mills and Spencers only to dismiss them. Ideas common in European political thought, themselves already contested and ill-defined, were often reconstituted, pulverized, cannibalized, in Dipesh Chakravarti's word, or rejected in the light of the life worlds and recessive ideologies of the cultures that received them. Our concern with globalization, movement, connection and comparison is sometimes in danger of obscuring the fact that some ideas and what I call meaningful practices were incommensurable, immovable and not connected. As has been observed, not least by Hirani himself, he was perhaps too keen in Arabic thought to find echoes of European ideology in the thinkers he discussed, and wrote less about those who distanced themselves from the classical Western tradition through the invocation of Islamic ideas. A second conceptual problem arises from the relationship between social, political, and cultural history, and intellectual history on the one hand, and the history of political thought on the other. In the past, intellectual history seemed a rather remote and superior form of study, unconnected with people's everyday conditions. Difficult as this is to sustain in a European history, it makes even less sense in contexts ravaged by racism, poverty, and colonial wars, such as India or the Arab and Ottoman world in the 19th century. Yet ideas do have power, and attempts to relate their analysis to social and economic history should not result in either of these historiographical approaches being reduced to the other. We need to consider the space, as it were, between ideas and society, even when they were deeply penetrating each other. Finally, in this particular case, the range of Indian and Arabic political thought in the liberal age is so vast as to make comparison and contrast selective, to say the least. What Hirani called Arabic thought is really a relatively modern concept. Most of the writers he and his successors have discussed and operated within the broader context of Ottoman thought, which was powerfully influenced by statist absolutism in the 19th century. At the same time, particularist traditions of Syrian Christian and Coptic Christian political thought existed throughout the period, bringing into play both biblical exegesis and ideas of progress derived more obviously from European sources. I'm referring to figures such as Shibli Shumahil and Farah Untan, for instance. These interacted in complex ways with Muslim Egyptian political thought, which is the main object of comparison in this paper. Muslim Arabic thought itself was, of course, variegated, reflecting doctrinal differences between the various schools of law, and, of course, different political projects. To what extent, indeed, could the leftist writers of the 1940s and 50s, who flit through Hirani's pages, be considered either Arabic, beyond the language they wrote in, or Muslim in any very strict sense? In the case of India, it's equally difficult to assess the vast range of Hindu, Sikh, and Indian Muslim political thought over more than a century. The concept of Hinduism as a public religion was itself a late development, reflecting the appearance of what I call Hindu counter-preachers, such as Swami Vivekananda, on a Western stage, rather than any developing doctrinal uniformity in India itself. I'll argue that Indian Muslims themselves, internally divided in very complex ways, were also probably more deeply influenced by Western secularism and common law than their compeers in the Middle East. Yet, purist movements such as the Tablighi Jamaat emerged in late colonial India to parallel in a softer way the Muslim Brotherhood. In both these regions, the movements have become publicly more active in recent times. Yet, comparison on this scale may still yield some interesting insights, both in terms of historical change and also historiography. Reading Hirani's introduction to the 1983 edition of Arabic Thought, it becomes clear that some common assumptions have influenced the writing of Middle Eastern and Indian historiography over the past generation, and that some of these issues remain of concern today. Hirani noted, for instance, that his book was written in the immediate aftermath of the first flush of independence in the Middle East, and he reflected a tendency to see the concepts of liberalism and nationalism as virtually interchangeable. This was long the case in Indian historical writing as well. In reality, liberal ideas of human flourishing were both broader and at the same time more limited than, quote, nationalism in their concern with humanity, but also with a person and her rights. So the two concepts are related but shouldn't be amalgamated. Hirani and his pupils were also struggling in the 1960s and 70s with a very instrumentalist understanding of political ideas. Eli Kaduri, in particular, seemed to believe that for Hourani's protagonists, such as Al-Akhani or Abdu, ideology was a mere mask for material gain or self-interest. This idea was mirrored in the quite old Cambridge school of Indian history writing of Anil Seal and Jack Gallagher, with which I was at once loosely associated at the same period. Even that fine intellectual historian of India, Eric Stokes, later despaired of his work on English utilitarianism in India, dismissing it as a record of one clerk talking to another. He said that to me. This sort of instrumentalism was later denounced as, quotes, animal politics by Tapan Rai Chaudhuri, who of course was here for a long period, who studied 19th century Bengal Renaissance. At more or less the same time, Hourani politely refuted Kaduri's criticism of his work. Even now we sometimes hear that the study of social processes is more important than the history of ideas. This is a different point, of course, but there is often a historiographical overlap between devotees of unmediated social and economic history and those who take a cynical view of the motivations of politicians and public figures. Yet ideas were speech acts in society, while meaningful practices, as I call them, Gandhi's salt marsh or the Mahdi's vow to pray in Cairo and Istanbul, for instance, also reflected the acting out of ideology. So it's time that this crude manichaeism between ideas and social processes was abandoned. I want now briefly to discuss some key analogies and differences between Indian and Arabic thought in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm attempting to highlight issues which need investigation rather than come up with firm conclusions. My lack of linguistic competence in the Arabic case would make that impossible. But I'll discuss the following issues. Firstly, the emergence of longue durée historicism in both these societies, along with a discourse of originary democracy, or at least consultation by political authority. Secondly, the points at which classical liberal thought was interdicted by what I call the principle of eternity, in both the Arabic and the Indian cases. Thirdly, a related issue, the contest and conflation between Sharia and law. Finally, I'll consider some aspects of economic thought in the two regions. So, the historicist trajectory. A common feature of much 19th century Indian and Arabic thought, as also European thought, was what has been called evolutionary historicism by G.G. Egos and others. That is a moralized, relatively static, and evolutionary sense of the past, in which civilizations are held to progress through time according to inherited and immanent social characteristics. Yet this historicism was both historically very deep and also redolent of a sense of place. So, for instance, European nationalists trace their greatness back to the Saxon kings or the Germanic enemies of the Romans, while European liberals saw the seeds of representative government inherent in the Athens of Cleisthenes or the Roman Republic. By contrast, an Indian writer of the 1820s, Ram Raz, dismissed the idea that the subcontinent's classical architecture was derived either from Greek or from Egyptian originals, and insisted that it was an autochthonous development on Indian soil, and that any similarities reflected the fact that human needs were much the same everywhere. Other broadly Hindu authors consistently traced the origins of Indian social and political forms back to the days of the ancient Hindu kings, or in some cases, even the Buddhist ruler Ashoka. Here, there's a direct parallel with contemporary Egyptian thought, as it's been explored by Hourani and more recently Abdallah Larui, an intellectual such as Rifawa al-Taltawi, who was characterized by Hourani as one of the first generation of the Arabic liberals, wrote of Egypt's glorious past under the pharaoh Sesostris, when great canals were built to make the land fruitful. By implication, Muhammad Ali's projects of modernization were contemporary examples of such benign statecraft. The most striking example of the search for distant origins was, of course, the first performance of Verdi's Aida in Ibrahim Pasha's opera house. Omnia el Shakri has demonstrated how this historicist sensibility was transformed by later nationalist thinkers into specifically Egyptian disciplines of ethnography, later anthropology, geography, sociology, particularly after about 1910. By the later 19th century, the reception of Darwin had reconstituted evolutionary historicism in a more scientific form. Most Indian liberal thinkers were relaxed about Darwinism, even social Darwinism, managing to re-inject it with spirit with greater ease than many European Christian apologists who struggled with the creation story. Vedantism, Arya Samajist rationalism, and the Hindu version of theosophy found it relatively unproblematic to turn a blind eye to the radicalism of the concept of natural selection. One self-styled Hindu theosophist maintained that the sacred teachings of the Hindus were, I quote, entirely in accordance with the idea of social evolution. He maintained the Vedas and Puranas were not simply divine stories, but records of historical change. In India, as another writer put it, the discoveries of modern science had never had to run the gauntlet of pious prejudice. Religion is not a matter of mere dogma with the Hindu. Even in matters of religion, we court criticism and challenge controversy. We love discussion and encourage speculation. In the Arabic world, too, Darwinism had a relatively soft landing, at least until the mid-20th century. Jamal ud-Din al-Afghani himself was not won over, but Marwa el-Shakri has shown how thinkers such as Hussein al-Jisr, a Sufi Syrian, was able to intertwine scientific ideas with theological sources and Quranic exegesis to normalize a version of Darwinism, which still allowed for an original creation by God. Even al-Jisr's pupil, Rashid Rida, who was harder-edged on questions concerning Islam and polity, used this hermeneutics to equivocate on the matter of evolution. The language of progress, taqaddum, moving forward, was very widely used and deployed by Muslim writers as well as Christians in the Middle East. And it's only quite recently that proponents of Darwinism in the region have been subject to the scrutiny of religious courts and accused of blasphemy. This style of thinking, some of which vaulted back before the time of the Prophet Muhammad and Arabism to pharaonic Egypt, was not unknown amongst Indian Muslim thinkers. Some 18th century Indian Muslim scholars even suggested that the Hindu deities Rama and Krishna were precursors of the prophets, a move which antagonized the more purist ulama of the contemporary school of Shah Waliullah. While the influence of British and French Orientalism and archaeology is evident in both regions, we shouldn't suggest that this search for rooted historicist pasts was mere mimicry of the West, or diffused from it, to go back to an earlier point. The court intellectuals of the 16th century, Mughal Emperor Akbar, had sought imperial legitimacy in the Hindu monarchs of the past and their scriptures. Egyptian writers well before the Napoleonic invasion had also alluded to the pharaonic past with pride, while their Ottoman overlords had claimed descent from the Roman and Byzantine dynasts, and some Lebanese Christian writers even traced their descent to the Phoenicians. This invocation of deep nationality took a particular form in early liberal political thought in both regions. One of the key themes in my book, Recovering Liberties, is the discourse of original Indian democracy, which liberals claim to see in the history of the local representative body, the Panchayat or Sabha. Indian writers such as Ram Mohan Roy and Ram Raz claimed that this had existed from ancient times, and although corrupted by Muslim despotism and debased by the East India Company, it had persisted through to the present. This supported their claim that Indians were never ruled by mere despots, as Orientalists and the East India Company officials, or many of them, asserted. Consequently, Indian demands for representative, civic bodies, or representation on colonial grand juries, for instance, were legitimated by history. Ram Mohan Roy, writing in the 1810s and 20s, developed a more elaborate idea that there once had existed an ancient Indian constitution which had balanced the various elements of the state: Brahmins, warriors, merchants, and toilers. This constitution had been destroyed by civil war, Muslim and British despotism, but was ripe for reinvention under the British, who were providential but only temporary rulers of India. The notion of constitution was a global intellectual trope in the early 19th century, of course. It represented a compromise between the idea of the people, which burst into the realm of polities in 1789 and again in 1848. On the other hand, the need for order, property, and the legitimacy of rulers was stressed. To cite again a musical representation of this concept, Richard Wagner's early opera Rienzi, set in medieval but republican Rome, sees the protagonist, Rienzi, begged by the citizens to take power on their behalf through a kind of Lockean constitution. Yet, constitutionalism in India and the Arab lands was once again legitimated intellectually with reference to indigenous forms. Ramohan looted the Vedic texts and invented a neologism for constitution from Sanskrit terms to express it. In the Middle East, liberals wishing to impose limits on the powers of the sultans and the khedives sometimes alluded to the concept of shura, or consultation, of the Prophet's time. While shura perhaps implied only a limited representative character, some writers used it to critique the more absolutist programs of the Tanzimat statesmen. Hourani noted that in Tunisia in the 1860s a kind of constitution was established, built on an idea of representation, citizens' rights against oppression, and a degree of equality between Muslims and non-Muslims. An Ottoman prince in exile, Mustafa Fazil Pasha, called for an Ottoman constitution in 1866. His remonstrance was circulated in Cairo in the 1890s, and during the British occupation of Egypt, Muhammad Abdu also devised a representative constitution. We see here both Indian and Arabic liberals staging a kind of epistemic insurgency against the nostrums of liberal imperialism as explored in various contexts by Uday Mehta, Jennifer Pitts, and G. Buck Morse. This mode of thought, in another of Dipesh Chakravarty's redolent phrases, relegated non-European peoples to the waiting room of history until they'd been schooled in the arts of civil society and representation. In the thought of Henry Maine, reiterated by governors across the British Empire and by Lord Cromer in Egypt, local panchayats or village assemblies were primitive organizations representing merely the lowest rung of despotism. By contrast, the early generations of Arabic and Indian public men lauded them as sophisticated institutions which had been undermined by foreign invasion, most recently European domination, and could rapidly be reconstituted as agents of popular empowerment. So I now move on to monarchy and its avatars. Reading Hourani and later writers on Muslim political thought, however, I wonder if there wasn't some quite early divergence here, at least in theory, between the power and legitimacy of the sultan, khedive or ruler in the Islamic case and the Indian case. Hourani himself seems to argue that it was ultimately the ruler who'd been endowed with authority by God and his prophet. Representatives of the people, the literati and the ulama could give advice, but this advice was never binding. Malcolm Kerr, one of Hourani's pupils, noted that even the liberal Abdu spoke of Sharia as prescribing social laws both in general and in detail. By contrast, in India, even the akhlaq or ethical literature of Indian Muslims seems to suggest that the pious and learned had a more elevated role in establishing right living and right government. Equally, Aziz al-Azmeh has written in his work Muslim Kingship of the attachment of liberal intellectuals in the Arab world to the ideal of the Ottoman Sultanate or its subordinate quasi-royal offices such as the Khedivate. This persisted even after Ataturk's abolition of the office. Kingship, after all, survived in Egypt until 1952 and Iraq and Jordan until a few years later. In Hindu and Hindu-derived thought, the ruler was perhaps less central than in the Middle East, not only because he was the leader of the Biradari, a brotherhood of his near equals, but also because for many there was no single god or prophet to confer on him this ultimate authority. The contrast should not be overdone because liberals in Egypt, Lebanon and Syria invoked the importance of the press and civil society organizations as vehicles of God's benevolence. Christian Arabs and Copts in particular developed this theme. Nevertheless, some degree of distinction probably can be made. In Hindu India, much spiritual power was vested in the Brahmin, who was an actual embodiment of godliness and not simply an interpreter of the law or Sharia like the ulama. It's striking too how early anti-monarchism, indeed a kind of republicanism, emerged in India compared with the Middle East. Nor can this be put down entirely to the co-option by the British of the Indian princes and the consequent contempt for them amongst nationalists, for something comparable happened in Egypt. Republicanism was not simply the result of the politics of the end of empire in the two regions, but reflected a much earlier Indian ambivalence about monarchy and its morally curtailed status. True, an Indian Muslim thinker such as Amir Ali, ironically himself of Shiite lineage, was one of the foremost defenders of the Khilafat Sultanate in the early 1920s. But Indian commitment to royalty was weaker on ideological as well as political grounds. The young Gandhi praised the princely states of India, but only for instituting local representative bodies, unlike the situation in British India. A ruler such as Saiji Rao of Baroda privately supported the nationalist and Brahmin radical Bal Gangadhar Tilak, yet the liberal and nationalist elite widely regarded the princes unfavourably. When republicanism triumphed in India, if not in Pakistan, it was largely high-caste civil society leaders who took over, not the military one-party state neo-monarchs of the Arab world. So I move on now to Sharia and the principle of harm. It's here, considering the relationship between religious power and political authority, that we might invoke Mill's principle of harm, which I mention in the introduction to Recovering Liberties. I use this classical argument as a template against which to measure Indian liberal thought. Social intervention in others' actions, Mill believed, is appropriate when they do actual harm, as in the case of physical violence or theft, for instance. But intervention could not be on the grounds that we don't like what others do. We can't ban alcohol, for instance, because drunkenness on the part of others is an invasion of what Mill called my social rights. He rejected this utterly. So monstrous a principle is far more dangerous than any single interference with liberal and liberty. There is no violation of liberty which he would not justify. This can be compared with what I call the principle of eternity, which we find in Islam, Hinduism and Buddhism, but also in Christian Catholic Europe generally, in fact. So, for instance, many Orthodox Sanatini Hindus felt that the slaughter of cattle caused actual harm because it violated the right of spirit to pass from one rebirth to another, the cow being high on the ladder of karmic spiritual evolution. Similarly, singing bawdy songs outside mosques or abusing the Prophet did actual harm to the divine order of life. Of course, modern philosophers have often debated the meaning of harm and have critiqued Mill's position in various ways. But it's certainly the case that both Hindus and Muslims judged the concept of social duties against moral and transcendental principles, and also posited different orders of time in which harm could be said to have been done. In India, this has often led to practices being banned because they caused offence to one community or another. In 1885, the Indian National Congress acknowledged this by agreeing that no issue could be debated if it caused offence to more than 2/3 of any one religious community, itself a new concept. Quite recently, the appearance of Salman Rushdie at the Jaipur Literary Festival was banned on the grounds that it caused offence to the Muslim community. Across the Muslim world, in India, Afghanistan and the Middle East, this held true in the liberal age and still holds true today. One need only think of the consequences of the burning of the Quran at Bagram. However, any speech, act or meaningful practice which caused offence to the words and message of the Prophet brought perhaps the most excessive examples of the elimination of Mill's principle of harm by the principle of eternity. Within the Islamic community, any group denying that the Prophet Muhammad was the summation of prophecy, or being thought to deny it, has been a particular target of condemnation and exclusion. In India, the Ahmadiyyas, who are deemed to have postulated the coming of prophets after Muhammad, are a case in point, while in the Middle East, groups such as the Ismailis, Druze and Alawites have sometimes been suspected of this invasion of religious truth. Insulting the gods has often attracted violence and repression in India, but since there's no one god or last prophet, this has never become normative. When an Indo-British writer appeared to insult the god Ram in the 1960s and the government of India banned his book, K.M. Panikkar, a leading intellectual, was outraged. He pointed out that there was a great, and quotes, he used the word, liberal tradition of parodying and abusing deities in the form of avatars, particularly in South India. Panikkar was presently concerned with the danger of mass opinion becoming coercive, and in particular revivalism and the activities of preachers of backwardness. This reflects one important distinction which can be made between Indian liberals of the colonial era and those of the Arabic and Ottoman world in respect of the principle of harm. It concerns the status of inherited legal precepts in the two contexts. Most of the major Muslim Arabic thinkers discussed by Hurani and his successors were constrained to one degree or another by the interpretation of Sharia when they discussed progress, community, family or gender at an abstract level. Some felt that Sharia could be adjusted at the margins to bring it into accordance with modernity. Others followed the Ottoman principle of the Reform era, the Tanzimat, in trying to expand the scope of secular law, Kanun. Yet Sharia and Islamic law remained a more significant, if marginally flexible, constraint within which all illiberal thought needed to exist. I'm not denying here that pragmatic forms of secular law had come into being across the Arabic and Ottoman worlds in the 19th century, and that Islamic law had been relegated to a different level of sensibility. Modern scholars, again, have shown that thinkers such as Rida were much more unsystematic in their recourse to Islamic thought than was once believed. Equally, Hindu conservatives have often recourse both to the Vedas and Puranas as sources of ultimate unchangeable truth. This was particularly the case in discussions of family law and the rights of women, in particular the right of Hindu widows to inherit. Rather, my claim is to suggest that Sharia-mindedness, to use Marshall G S Hodgson's phrase, remained omnipresent, particularly at the more abstract level. Arabic Muslim thinkers, even the most radical neo-Marxist ones, worked hard to contain it within their theories of social and political development. Christian and Jewish writers were not directly constrained by Islamic law, of course, but it must be recognized that the dominant Muslim tradition was ultimately more influential. This was in significant contrast to the case in India, even Muslim India, where Sharia-mindedness was less of an issue. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, rather than Muhammad Iqbal, was the representative thinker. Jinnah demanded a state for Muslims, not a Sharia state, still less an Islamic state. Ironically, he did once in the late 1930s invoke Sharia, as Faisal Devji has reminded us, but this was in a limited area of female inheritance, where he felt that Muslim law was more favourable to women than South Asian custom. He was defeated in the Legislative Assembly by a cabal of Muslim landowners. For Hindus and Sikhs, there was no real analogy to Sharia. The Vedas and the Puranas could be mined to legitimate a multitude of different and contradictory positions. the existence of one God, or many, or even none. Orthodox Hindus were in a very weak position, and in addition to the amorphousness of Hindu law and scripture, the impact of Mughal jurisdiction and colonial law in the subcontinent provides an important clue to the difference. The Mughals never attempted to impose Muslim law on the subcontinent. The dynasty's marriage with Hindu princesses and the traffic in ideas between different religious groups, especially under the Emperor Akbar, gave rise to a style of flexibility, if not exactly toleration. Colonial law played an even greater part. Law in India, unlike the case of Anglo-American common law, has rarely been considered as an aspect of intellectual history or political thought, often seeming to be a separate order of being marching through history as a teleological sequence of precedent. Indian writers of the colonial period talked of black letter law as a limit on judicial and political activism and a constraint on novel political thought. Nevertheless, a significant difference between India and the Middle East was the existence of Anglo-Indian law, civil and criminal, in colonial India. True, the British hived off family and customary law into something that was called Anglo-Mohammedan and Anglo-Hindu law, and as Ritu Birla has recently shown, the commercial law of Indian mercantile communities provided another category which was seen as separate from the rational law of the Anglosphere. All the same, in India, Islamic law was effectively tamed and relegated to the margins of thought and society through much of the long colonial period, and it never impacted on the Hindu population to any great extent. The renowned Muslim thinker Muhammad Iqbal is often seen as the founder of Pakistan, but for much of his career, his real intention was merely to bring into being a territory where Sharia would be binding on Muslims, not to create a separate state. A classical Indian Muslim liberal of the earlier period, such as Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, mentioned in the preface to Hurani's 1983 edition, had space for Muhammad's finality of prophecy deep in the core of his work, but elsewhere he accepted Western education, Anglo-Indian law, the providential, if temporary, role of the British colonial establishment, and the rationalistic, secularized progress of history, as Javed Majid has argued. Sharia, even for many Indian Muslim liberals, was the code of the Arabs of old, a glorious antique. It's interesting that a radical Hindu nationalist, Bipin Chandra Pal, who was otherwise favourable to the way in which Islam had broadened, I quote, the outer morals and social equalities of India, spoke still of its dominating legalism in 1909. Now this marked a significant difference from the Arab lands, where even rationalistic liberals, keen to open the doors of ijtihad or interpretation, continued to emphasize the centrality of Sharia. Muhammad Abdu, in particular, argued that ideas and practice might change, but only in the light of, quotation, the original and pure sources of the faith. Islam, according to thinkers like him, should act as a restraining force on modernity. Kerr elaborated, Abdu's break with the traditions of the millennial view of history and his espousal of evolution were equivocal and incomplete. He constantly reintroduced a legislative view of prophecy. Even when urging the creation of constitutions and arguing for liberty, thinkers such as Rida located these demands within the context informed by scripture and law. There was no real equivalent of this in the discussions of the Indian National Congress, let alone the Constituent Assembly debates of 1946 to 48. Even the Muslim League demanded separate electorates for Muslims. Any specifically Islamic agenda beyond the limited area of family law was very sotto voce. Most members of the Muslim League were, after all, common lawyers. Later Arabic legalists were even less accommodating, some even arguing that Abdu had opened the door to secularism. Sayyid Qutb and Hassan al-Banna were cases in point, and if their message was suppressed during the rule of the military in Egypt and Syria, it seems on the point of reasserting itself today. If there's been a recent move towards a more Muslim form of constitution in Pakistan, it's easier to see it as a consequence of rivalry with India, the need for secularism to legitimate the army and the influence of the Middle East Wahhabism, than a deeply ingrained local Muslim tradition. So I finally move on to statistical liberalism and moral economy. So, economic thought in the two regions during the liberal age. One central aspect of Indian political thought at the high point of the liberal age and through to Nehruvian quasi-socialism was the prominence of what I've called statistical liberalism. This is an approach to political economy which dissented from the norms of free trade, imperialism, but did so by using a wealth of economic statistics and some relatively sophisticated economic theory. I see this as an immediate and highly informed rejoinder to what Nicholas Dirks calls the ethnographic state. A classic case here was Dadabhai Naoroji, author of Poverty and Un-British Rule in India and one-time Liberal MP for a London constituency. Naoroji and a colleague from Western Indian Parsi communities spent months in the 1860s travelling in Western India, collecting statistics on output, market changes, and colonial land tax. He and other Indian political economists put together a detailed critique of colonial government, arguing centrally that India needed tariff protection, a doctrine that in the 20th century came to be called economic regionalism, and which constituted a rejection of universal economic principles in favour of an emphasis on the well-being of particular localities. Where a vast body of unemployed labour existed, it was better to promote protected industries, to absorb it, rather than having nothing at all. Another statistical liberal, the Bombay jurist K.T. Telang, used similar arguments. What economic liberty, the mantra of Cobden, Bright, and British devotees of laissez-faire, would India enjoy in the face of free trade, Telang asked. Here he used a powerful metaphor to stress the contingent nature of liberty, which I think anticipated Isaiah Berlin's distinction between its negative and its positive forms. He says, "You may well speak of a prisoner surrounded by a deep and wide moat, which he cannot cross over as enjoying liberty, because, forsooth, he has no fetters on his person." Only when Indians have the liberty to build their own capacities should they be subject to liberty conferred by the bracing air of free trade. People in the Arab and Ottoman world faced similar economic conditions, exemplified in particular by the Anglo-Ottoman Tariff Agreement of 1838, which had the effect of destroying many of the local industries which Muhammad Ali had established over the previous generation. The Egyptian economic crisis of the 1860s and 70s saw strenuous opposition to the Dual Control Treaty of 1865 and the austerity measures imposed by foreign technocrats, to use a phrase which would be understood by citizens of Greece today. To what extent, however, was opposition articulated in a theory of political economy like that of the Bombay liberals? Timothy Mitchell has shown how a government statistical regime similar to the Indian one was introduced in Egypt after the 1850s and extended after the British occupation. In 1909, a Société Khediviale d'économie politique, de statistique et de législation was established, comprising Egyptian businessmen and foreign specialists. It produced a journal, L'Égypte contemporaine. Hurani and his successors also noted that Al-Tatawi, Khairuddin, Lutfi al-Said, Rashid Rida, and other prominent Egyptian modernists alluded frequently to the dangers and opportunities inherent in economic change. Al-Tatawi stressed the importance of irrigation and the development of the country. Lutfi al-Said, writing in the wake of the British occupation of 1882, was more precise. Egypt had lost its independence because of the foreign debt, which must be redeemed, and it also needed to build up its own industries. I get the strong impression, however, both from the literature and from talking with scholars who know Arabic, that no compelling or elaborate school of political economy developed in the region before the interwar period, at least outside the Syrian Protestant College of Beirut. Hourani may provide one key to this. He implies that economic well-being was often subordinate in Arabic liberal thought to notions of virtue and proper conduct according to God's law. Of Tatawi he remarks, but it's characteristic of his thought to insist that national wealth is the product of virtue. Virtue could be instilled through education, but education consisted in the seamless teaching of God's will through which good life on this earth could be attained. Much later, Rashid Rida acknowledged that creating a wealthy society might be departing from some principles of Islamic law in the earlier age under the guise of a principle of necessity. But he quoted the Quran to make this point. Do not give fools the property which God has assigned to you to manage. In this context, one recent authority argues that economic thought in the Arabic world, particularly in the last half-century, has been limited by an over-concentration on those few Quranic passages which can be taken to apply to the economy, issues relating to banking, interest, and waqf in particular. Equally, Mitchell's study suggests that even Egyptian urban and non-Muslim intellectuals continue to adopt an almost Orientalist understanding of an unchanging and ignorant peasant, even into the 1960s, as witnessed the study of Henry Habib Arut of 1963. By contrast, as early as 1870, R.C. Dutt, amongst others, had mounted a sophisticated attack on colonial stereotypes of the peasant. Gandhi, of course, empowered the peasant with an almost divine nature as a redoubt of Indian virtue, even if Indian governments after Indira Gandhi have fallen back on paternalistic and aggressive developmentalism. In other words, what seems to have developed in the Arabic lands was not so much statistical liberalism as a form of moral economy, in which the essential act of theorizing was to adjust economic well-being and progress to God's law and scripture. Many Indian statistical liberals, of course, were also concerned to investigate their classical religious traditions, as were British liberals of the Gladstone era. But God was always relegated to the back seat in their treatises of political economy. Religion was neutral. The principle of karma was itself perfectly compatible with money-making and usury on a large scale, provided it was balanced by pious acts, as James Laidlaw and other anthropologists have found even today. An anti-colonial political economy was therefore able to emerge unshackled from the shadows of theology some time before it did so in Egypt and other parts of the Middle East. Mitchell suggests that even the concept of national economy only developed fully in Egypt, at least after national independence. Even in Anatolian Turkey or Lebanon, the notion of economic nationalism, Millat Iqtisadi, seems to have developed fully only in the generation before the First World War. As in the case of law, India's earlier exposure to British concepts and exploitation resulted in a different outcome from the Middle East. Yet equally, the inheritance of notions of local economic patriotism or moral economy from the earlier regimes also played their part. Many of the Indian liberals were moreover members of the Parsi community, Zoroastrians, who in the mid-19th century gloried in the idea that they were the Jews of the Indian Ocean. Others came from backgrounds which were associated with the highly complex systems of land revenue management and accounting which had characterized the pre-colonial Western Indian Maratha states and had been standardized by the British. Most of them, both in Bombay and Calcutta, had been schooled in the political economy analyses of the Scottish Enlightenment, though it's important to stress that Indian statistical liberalism was not simply a borrowing from the British. A final point then is this. There was perhaps a greater gulf in the Arabic lands between commercial activities and the learned servants of the state and society, precisely because so many of the major trading groups were not Muslim or were semi-outsiders, Syrian Christians, Jews, Armenians, even Coptic Christians, such as Salama Musa, who did in fact mount a searing critique of the economic effects of the British rule in Egypt. Notions of economic activity and progress were perhaps relatively less accessible to the Muslim intellectual elites. In this context, it's interesting to note that even in India, there were relatively few Muslim liberals who deployed the same sophisticated arguments in political economy as their Parsi, Jain, or Hindu contemporaries. One of the few conversant with statistical liberalism was the Bombay congressman Badruddin Tyabji, but he was an Ismaili Bohra from a heterodox community according to the Sunnis, and one with strong maritime commercial connections. So I'll end up by suggesting that global intellectual history is a sensibility, a way of approaching history, rather than a field or even a turn, as in the cultural turn. It's not exclusive to the history of cultural ideas. I could have spoken about the impact of socialism in the two contexts, or the uniqueness of Gandhi. So, global intellectual history interacts with social and political history rather than divorcing itself from them. But it does reflect the power of ideas. In this respect, Albert Hourani created a whole field. Thank you very much.
We're live. I bring you greetings from the Middle East Center, to which Albert Hourani retired in 1958 to pen the last chapters of Arabic thought in the liberal age before it came out in 1963. And in this, the 50th anniversary year of that important book, I think Albert would indeed have taken tremendous heart in the idea that someone of the standing of Christopher Bailey would choose the themes that he had framed his study of Arab thought as a point of departure for a study of historiography for a lecture series such as the Humanities. And more than that, to cross bridges between parts of the world whose historical experiences have far more in common than the way in which we as scholars study these regions might lead you to believe. We all too seldom cross over from the Middle East Center to our colleagues in Asian studies to talk about what in the history and experience and ideas of the peoples that we study might give us food for thought. Instead, we tend to go about the thankless task of reinventing the wheel culture by culture, when I think that there's a great deal more to be taken from this global intellectual history that, as a turn, is certainly a turn for the better. I listened to this lecture thinking I was going to catch a sting that was going to in some way undermine the edifice that Albert Hourani had put forward about an evolution of thought and a transmission of ideas between Europe and the Arab world. And I must confess I didn't hear one. In fact, Albert didn't have to wait 50 years to see his ideas under very severe attack. The late Elie Kaddouri has already been invoked. In his criticism of Albert's work, he began with the title, and he basically dismissed it word by word. It wasn't Arabic. It wasn't thought. It wasn't liberal. And there was no age. So you can see from that point of departure where Albert Hourani found that the treatment he'd be meted out tonight was far more understanding, sympathetic, and I think in line with the driving parameters of his own approach to the study of Arabic thought and of intellectual history more generally. Is the kind of discussion that I imagine Hourani having with a much smaller group than this. He used to gather something called the Near East Studies Group, where scholars visiting or based in British universities would gather in a living room to take the ideas that they had further. They would do so by crossing time differences. So this is where Hourani got involved in questions like the Islamic city, which drew him, the modernist in Oxford, much more into medieval history or into ideas of Islamic thought. It wasn't totally an academic exercise for him because, of course, he was seeing in the works of scholars in the modern era, such as El-Afghani and Abdu and Rida, a genealogy of intellectual thought that he could trace right back to what his colleagues in medieval intellectual history were doing. And of course, from within the confines of his own college, Hourani was able to share views with people like Tapan Ray Chaudhry and whatnot. I mean, to bridge across the areas. But I still had the sense it didn't happen as often, even in a community dedicated to area studies like St. Antony's, as it should. It still doesn't today. So what do we have here? We have a discussion of intellectual history, liberal thought, in two distinct parts of the world, both of which approached a body of ideas that might be taken as having started in Europe, but were, to quote you, crushed and cannibalized on the way to India or to the Arab world. I would almost prefer talking about an idea of translation, that you had ideas, and I think that the European connection remains important in both the Indian and the Middle Eastern examples, that you had ideas that were becoming dominant in their age, and that were being transmitted by a number of different types of personalities, in which Indians and Arabs were not passive vehicles receiving these ideas. The same boats that brought merchants or colonial administrators to the Eastern Mediterranean or to the Indian Ocean also returned to Europe, and often they carried with them Indians and Arabs who would come and trade here. They would come and study in places like this, in places like that, and take away what they understood of the ideas of the time. If we were to go through this room today and look at the notes that you have taken, those of you who still take notes, I bet you that we would find tremendous differences in the way we wrote down what we heard of the ideas being exchanged tonight. And yet, as an epistemic community, we have a great deal more in common than, let us say, the average Egyptian intellectual would have with Egyptian society at large. But what we hear, we receive through different ears, and we filter through different experiences, and it comes out differently on the page. And in this way, too, ideas as translated from a European source and received in a different culture through the filters of history, experience, religion, society, ideas, whatnot, quite distinct in different contexts, is inevitably going to take off in different directions and become appropriated by the host societies. So what we have here in this global intellectual history is the opportunity to see how a kind of idea of the time is taken, developed, transformed, appropriated, and made into something which, for late Kaduri be damned, is indeed Arab, is indeed Indian, and is indeed quite distinctive from the European sources that might have been in the origins of some of these concepts. But there was a critique that I think stung Hourani, because he did conflate liberalism and the idea of national liberation, and that these were things that would bring benefits to the individual as part of a society striving towards a better goal. And that was the way in which the ideas he had identified came to be appropriated by the agents of autocracy, certainly in the Arab experience. And I think as I come to my opening question for you, Chris, it's going to be the degree to which liberal thought feeds autocracy in the Indian example as well. The ideas of intolerance, of sectarianism, of denial of individual rights. We see these captured quite recently in the writings of a Syrian journalist, the late Samir Kassir, who compared and contrasted the first decade of the 21st century, an age that he saw being really the low point in the modern Arab experience, in which the role model was a suicide bomber. And he asks, how do we get reduced to this morbid state from the high point we once knew, which he identified as the Nahda, which is the era that Hourani has identified as the liberal age, and which he traces as something much more than a 19th century phenomenon, but sees coming right up until the early 1960s, and links not just to the thinking of people like Shibli Shumayl and Antoine Farah, or the Islamic modernists, but also in the experience of revolutionary Egypt, with its role in bridging with Asia and Africa in non-alignment, or the emergence of cinema in Egypt, and of the novel, linked to other sort of ideas that took root at this time. So the question really is, in the years that followed Hourani's writing this book, was he borne out that there was a liberal trend to Arabic thought? Or did the autocratic turn in some way crush that liberalism that he, I think, so hoped would be the path towards Arab fulfillment and achievement? in a funny sort of way, between the time when he wrote that book and nearly 50 years later, it would be 5 decades before you'd see Arab people return to the kind of enthusiasm politics of the hope for popular change, or change through popular action, which we saw in 2011 and which already is proving very problematic. But in the in-between decades, indeed, liberal thought took a very difficult turn. Is that the case also when one looks at Asia and the emergence of, let's say, community politics, the way in which the separation or the partition of India has led to a succession of wars, of nuclear states that are rivals for power? And indeed, is the liberal age something that will need to be revived in India or in Pakistan, as indeed it needs to be done in the Arab world?